Good afternoon. My name is Troy Zerveskis. I'm the principal of Advisory Resource Group. We are a planning and advisory firm that works almost exclusively with physicians and dentists. Welcome to Financial Literacy for New Professionals. My partner, Rich Sentnor, is also on the call this afternoon.
Hello, everyone.
So what we'd like to do today is give you an introduction to the things that a new professional should be thinking about. We understand that a lot of things are thrown at a new professional, and so this presentation is really about helping them understand what things they should be thinking about. So a quick introduction of Rich and I. We've been speaking at hospitals and medical schools for the last 15 years, mostly in the Boston area. We've got relationships with Tufts and Harvard and Boston University and a number of others. Our focus, again, is from residency to retirement. We work with our clients. The way our practice is modeled really works with people from when they're first beginning their careers, really all the way through retirement. We work with our clients all around the United States. Our specialty has become financial literacy for new professionals. We realize how much is thrown at a new doctor and a new dentist, and so our world has really been about understanding those items and really helping them make the best decisions with the situations that they have at hand. And Rich and I work as a team. So our goals this afternoon are, what should we be thinking about prior to transition? Understanding the financial issues pertinent to a medical resident and new professional, prioritizing these issues, helping to understand how do we create an action plan, and as always, we offer a personalized consultation to discuss these things specifically, as everyone truly does have a very different situation and different circumstances as it relates to financial issues. So what we'd like to do today is really give you a foundation to get you started. It's not to try to make you an expert. So we're not going to talk about a lot of specific, how much can you contribute to a Roth IRA types of conversation. It's going to be much more big picture about what we need to do, looking bigger picture. Talking about finding the balance between debt repayment and saving, building strong habits now to last a lifetime. As Rich and I often say, whether you're making $30,000 a year or $300,000 a year, a lot of these concepts stay constant. Understanding the importance of planning and taking a step back and looking at the big picture before we make decisions, protecting our income, and avoiding what we call the doctor traps.
Yeah, one of the main things that we want to make sure that we're focusing on is when you're transitioning throughout your career, whether it be from student to resident or resident to attending or attending to retirement, those are key points in your career, and it's when you should really be focusing the most on the things that we're going to talk about in the foundations and tools that we're going to be able to show you to use.
Absolutely. So the first step, what we would call Financial Planning 101, is what's known as a financial pyramid. And the thought process here is that we want to start with a strong foundation before working our way up. So what is a foundation financially? It's all, we like to say, the boring stuff. It's insurances, disability insurance, which we'll talk about more, life insurance, auto insurance, health insurance, estate planning documents if you have children, and probably most importantly is an emergency fund, money that we can get to today if we need it, in an event of emergency or other unforeseen event. Once we've taken care of the foundation, the next step is more of what we'd call the fun stuff. 401ks, mutual funds, IRAs, things that are going to help us ultimately accomplish the goals that we're looking to achieve. And then lastly is speculation, and some people never choose to get here, but this is taking a lot more risk, hoping to get a much greater rate of return. And so as I've alluded to here, the importance of having this strong foundation is to hold everything else up and to prioritize what we should be doing at each stage. And so if we were to start with putting money in mutual funds and 401ks and ignore that emergency fund and the protection items, if something were to happen, we'd need to rob from the top in order to feed the bottom, and our whole house could fall over. So for many people to start, they're really not going any further than that foundation layer, and even the first couple of years of residency might just be creating that emergency fund and doing that quote-unquote boring stuff.
One of the critical components that we find for most of our younger docs or even the ones that are just getting started, if they're not younger, is to just start to build those habits that Troy alluded to earlier, and you know, getting that foundation set and just building those habits of actually starting to think about these things and finding the right person to help you assist with those things is critical in the process going forward.
Yeah, oftentimes you say it's like diet and exercise. Exactly. It's just doing the right things over and over, so that when your income does start to, you know, get to the point that you'd ultimately like it to be at, you've already built those muscles and are already comfortable using them. So all of those habits have already been established. So, and I think one of those core habits we're going to talk about next is around budgeting. For us, budgeting is like vital signs. Whatever client we begin working with, again, whether they're making $30,000 a year or $300,000, we're always asking them about their cash flow. And that really comes down to what is their budget and what are their budgeting habits. I think there's a lot of negative connotations that come about when people think about budgeting. You know, it's never going to work. Something is always going to come up. I've tried in the past. We know that. We know that there's going to be issues that arise. We know that we're going to have to put new tires on our cars. We know there's things that are going to interrupt the budget. But the goal is, if we can be correct 10 months out of 12 months or 8 months out of 12 months, well, that's a lot better than if we're only 2 or 3 out of those 12 months, or we don't even know necessarily what correct actually means in relation to the budget. So I think to start, we want to break it down to its simplest essence, which is really what we're trying to understand is what's coming in, what's going out, what's that difference, and how are we using that difference.
And this is one of the most, you know, basic, you know, key points that you can take away from what we're talking about here. And we talk to a lot of, you know, physicians, a lot of medical students that are transitioning, and, you know, they're sometimes apprehensive about what can I be doing, and I don't really have any money, I shouldn't be doing this. If there's one of the major points that you can take away, this is kind of the key, and it's understanding where your money is going. And this is going to be for your entire life, as Troy has alluded, whether you're making $30,000 or $300,000. Understanding what your cash flow is and what money is going out is critical. And if you're really looking at one component to try to start down this road, making sure you understand that is key to what you know, the financial plan is going to look like going forward.
Absolutely. And it also allows you to understand and create context around making decisions. So certainly one of the big ones when you're transitioning out of residency is, should I buy a house? Should I rent? Well, it's all going to come down to this budget, as we're going to talk about in a second. Should I buy a new car? Should I not? So really the first step is identify your goals. Again, I'll use this in the context of transitioning out of training. You know, where do I want to go? What's the city I'm going to live in? Am I going to rent? Am I going to buy? And just start throwing everything down on a piece of paper or a, you know, a Word document of just, you know, what you would like to accomplish. Next, estimate your income. If you have not transitioned yet, PaycheckCity.com is a website that will help you estimate what your income will be after transition. Understand your liabilities and expenses. So to the best that you can, you know, ask the landlord what the utility expenses are going to be and understand all the different components. And also your liabilities. If you're going to be going into student loan repayment, if you're going to be making income-based repayment, understand what those payments are going to be even before you're going to have to start making them. Number 4 is just saying that whatever is left over, that's called your discretionary income, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then number 5 is we look at as probably the most important stage of budgeting, which is once you've actually entered everything in, you want to go through multiple iterations to get the result that you're looking for. You know, it's very likely that after you've gone through and put everything down that you want to do, that you might not necessarily be able to afford all those things. So the process of trial budgeting is to continue to go through and make sort of different drafts of your budget until you come up with the one that feels like it will work the best. And then lastly, we want to consistently review how our decisions are impacting the results and almost setting up dates with ourselves to make sure that we're reviewing our budget as things change. So there's a spreadsheet, just an example of a spreadsheet that we would use. You could use an Excel document. Certainly send us an email on our website. There's also the electronic budget spreadsheet that we use. We're happy to provide that for you. But really any method, even a notebook, can work for the budgeting process. So let's run through an example, and Rich, feel free to jump in any time here. So this is Chris. Chris is a resident. He makes $55,000 a year, so that roughly means his take-home is about $3,300 a month. He does have an income-based loan repayment of $375. He's renting a one-bedroom apartment. His utility expenses, $750. Entertainment, he's estimated to be $250 a month. It was important for Chris to buy a car. He's working about 10 miles from his apartment, so he felt that it made more sense to do that. And then basic insurances, auto, renters, disability, life insurance. So when we look at Chris, how did he do? He's got about $250 a month left over. Did Chris do a good job? Rich, what do you think?
Yeah, well, the good news is, Chris does have some cash available, not a whole lot, and, there's not a whole lot of, room in his budget here, but the good news is at least he's, cash flow positive, and we're not in a situation where we're bleeding money. But this is the purpose of kind of a trial budget and being able to say, okay, what could Chris do a little bit better? Can we go back and sharpen our pencil? Can we figure out ways that Chris can potentially have some additional discretionary income to be able to help him with things like student loan repayments, or maybe some investment accounts, or maybe trying to save to buy a house, or whatever the case may be. So if we have Chris go back and sharpen his pencil, the reality of the fact when you're going into residency is the top line item or your income number really isn't going to change, right? So Chris is still making $55,000. He's probably going to make around that for the next 3, 6, 9, 12, however many years you guys decide that you're going to continue to do residency training. So you don't have much control over that. So what he has control over is the outflows and where he's spending the money. So the number one thing that we see all the time, Chris is still going to have an IBR payment, is your biggest cost, which is your housing. So you guys have been students for a long time, you've been residents, you don't want to have a roommate, but if you look at what a roommate could potentially do, Chris gets a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate. The reality is he's never there anyway. So he's paying $800 as opposed to what he was paying solo. He saves a little bit of money on his utilities and his gas and cable and all that sort of stuff. He still tightens his belt a little bit on his entertainment. He needs his car. He needs his basic insurance. But at the end of the day, when we look at Chris is done, now he's at almost $800 a month, which is a lot different than the $250 or so that we were looking at before. There's a lot of different things that he can do now to help his situation going forward with $800. And this is really a basic example of what we call the trial budgeting, and being able to go back and look at your situation and what are some of the decisions that are making and how are they going to impact going forward. And what Troy and I help a lot of our clients with is, okay, you've done that part, now let me show you the impact of what that additional discretionary income is going to do for you, whether it be on student debt or on investing or on savings for the long term. And that's really the ultimate goal going forward.
Absolutely. And the context, going back to our first step in the budgeting process of understanding what we want. So if Chris says, well, I want to build my emergency fund, I want to take a trip each year, I want to be able to do some other things that are important to me. Well, now we can put that $800 a month into context to determine, how Chris is going to be able to achieve those goals. But it's a really important concept because, the applicable element of this is that if you're paying your bills at 10 o'clock at night, it's very reasonable to think that you might not be making the best decisions in order to achieve those long-term goals. So this is really a big piece of that, taking a step back to understand what's very important to you to start, and then putting the appropriate items in place in order to make sure that you get there. So I've always said that a budget is only as good as the mechanism by which you set up to track it. And we've got some great options now. So the first is software. You might have heard of Quicken or QuickBooks. These tools work really well. The problem is that the output is only as good as the input. And I don't want to set my clients up for failure, so a lot of times they don't have the time to do that input. Next is pen and paper. We've had clients come to us with these big ledger books, and they literally know every cent they've ever spent on anything. Again, can work really, really well, but the reality is most people aren't going to spend the time doing that. So lastly is, on the internet now, there's some great tools that are available. Probably the most popular is mint.com, mint.com. This allows you to link up your credit cards and your debit cards. It allows you to create a budget, and then it'll allow you to track that budget on a bar graph so that you can see exactly where you are relative to your spending each month. One piece that I will mention here that I think is really important is I think it's always best to use that spreadsheet or piece of paper, go through the trial budgeting process, do all of those things first on the spreadsheet, and then use mint.com as a method to track it. I would not suggest going to Mint directly and trying to create the budget there. You're really using it as just a mechanism to track the good work that you've already done. And again, like I said earlier, you want to go back through every once in a while and just update as your budget changes. And again, certainly those big transitions out of training to becoming an attending, that's when this process is most important. And I'll say absolutely most important in terms of achieving those longer term goals. There's definitely a lot of delayed gratification in a medical career, so you want to make sure that once you do transition and your income does go up, that we are looking at, okay, how much do I need to be putting towards retirement, my kiddos' education, et cetera, before we make some of these big decisions.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll mention on that is that, as we talked about, that is kind of the vital signs, and it's just one of those things that even if you just kind of set it up and you get it done, even if you don't, really, execute it going forward, just doing that is going to put you in a better position. It's going to get you into that state of mind. It's going to start to build that habit for you, and that's going to be huge for you, going forward.
Yeah, I think, we've all heard it, and certainly Rich and I hear it probably weekly, but our clients saying, oh, I don't have any money, there's nothing I can do to get started. And so to Rich's point, just doing those very simple things and just kind of beginning to train yourself to think differently, that alone is going to help you, down the road. It's again, it's diet and exercise, and it's building those muscles that might not be very strong right now. So this brings us to the next point. Once we've created that budget and once we understand what's left over, well, what do we do with that difference? Where does it go? And I think most people need a process, and you may have heard this when you were young. You may have heard people say, well, pay yourself first. And this to us is really the only way that busy professionals can make progress. And it's the idea of setting up an automated structure to get to the goals that you're looking to get to. And so let me talk about this a little bit more. So first, the dollar sign here is your paycheck. That's your income. On the other side is you, and then in the middle there's a net, and we're going to come back and talk about that in a moment. And then we have different buckets corresponding to the time horizon that we might need to use our money. So a short-term bucket is a checking account, a savings account. It's a place that you can get to your money almost immediately. On the stark opposite of that is a long-term bucket. That's going to be your retirement plan at work. It's going to be an IRA. It's a place that you might put your money to get good tax advantages from it, but because of that, you can't get to those assets. And then midterm is in the middle. It's money that you don't want to lock up for retirement, but it's also money that you don't want to just have sitting around in cash. Just a little anecdote here. For most people, midterm is something that they'll do after they're in their careers. And then lastly is debt reduction. That's taking or making payments towards your debts over and above what's required of you, making accelerated payments in order to try to pay that debt down sooner. So what this net is really a bill that you're setting up to yourself to automatically fund whichever of these buckets you deem to be most important. So let's use a quick example. Chris has that $800 a month left over, but he doesn't have an emergency fund. So for Chris, he might set up an automatic payment from his online banking to go directly into his short-term savings. And maybe he does that for the whole $800 a month. Or maybe he does $600 a month to the short term and does $200 a month towards an IRA or a Roth IRA, we'll talk about in a little bit, in terms of beginning to save a little bit for retirement. Then, once he has his short-term bucket full, his emergency fund, which we usually say 3 to 6 months of expenses is what we like to see in that bucket, then he might say, okay, well, now I'm going to put more towards my debt reduction, and I'm going to make a larger payment towards my retirement. But the thought process, I'm sorry, I was going to say one last thing, Rich, is the thought process is that all of this is automated. Chris isn't giving any thought to this. He's making all of these payments in his online banking account, and they're all happening in spite of him. So when he gets to the end of the year and looks back, he's made this progress without having to give any thought to it.
And the reality is everybody's situation is going to be completely different based on a variety of different factors. How much debt do you have? Are you single or are you married? Are you, do you have credit card debt? How much savings do you have? What are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? How long is your training? All these different things are going to come into play. But the concept of paying yourself first, the concept of setting this up, and Troy hit on the most important point, which is you guys are very busy. You work crazy hours. And sitting down and doing this at 12 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning when you finally have some time to do it doesn't always lend to making the best decisions. So having this process in place is the key component of what we're trying to talk about. And, based on those individual various items that we talked about, what Troy and I do is help our clients be able to figure out what is the best scenario, what is the best way to use this net to ultimately achieve the goals that you want to be able to achieve.
Absolutely, and it's really fun to see people who we start working with in the beginning of their residencies at the end who have accumulated that emergency fund and other assets. And again, they'll be the first to tell us, "Gosh, I would have never done this had I not set up a structure in order to make sure that I've made that progress." So very important concept, paying yourself first. And again, we're going to go right back to where we said with budgeting. That is something that can be done. Again, even if it's $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever that number might be, it's just about doing it on a consistent basis and begin flexing those muscles. So
yeah. The next topic we're going to touch on is just, we're going to just touch on this real quick. This is something that we think is important. We like to just bring up to kind of put it in your guys' mind, and it's regarding protecting your credit. A couple of key points here for you guys. Again, very busy professionals. Make sure that you guys are opening your mail. That includes email as well. You're going to get a lot of correspondence. Sometimes we sit down with clients to do a 6-month review, and they just come with a stack of unopened mail. And again, nowadays it's really more email than anything else. So I think, it's just knowing that you need to be able to make sure that you're staying on top of your stuff, especially with regard to student debt. Understanding your debts, understanding what the interest rates are, who your lenders are there programs that allow you to be able to, lower your debt, and really what it all centers around is protecting your credit. And credit is kind of key for any professional. Knowing your credit score, understanding how it works, and really that's a lifeline for you as an individual, both personally and professionally. It's your ability to borrow money, to buy a house, to open a practice, to buy into a practice. All those things get affected by your credit. And what your credit really is are you somebody that pays your bills on time? Are you somebody that actually pays back, the debt that you've borrowed and aren't late and aren't, ignoring any of those things, which is basically going to hurt your credit. So you want to add anything here, Troy?
No, I think just practically, I think we suggest that our clients, once a year, make sure that they pull their credit report and scores from each of the 3 carriers. This is something you can pay $30 or $40 to do. You can go to any one of the Equifax, TransUnion, Experian to do it. There are ways that you can get free reports and free scores, but again, we just want to make sure at the end of the day that you know what your report is and you know what your score is, because if you are looking to buy a house in the future, let's say after training, if there is an inconsistency of some sort on your report, it could take 3, 4, 6 months to fix, and you want to have done that well in advance of trying to make that purchase. The last thing that I would say is just be organized. We'll often tell our clients is on your desktop, just put a folder and call it financial stuff. And every time you talk to your lenders and every time you pull your credit reports, just throw everything in this file so everything's in one consolidated place. and just to keep a journal of what you've done. A lot of this, again, just comes down to just remembering and being organized for what you've done. So, when Rich and I are in a session together, the first question that we asked, does anybody in the room have debt? And everybody raises their hand. And then the next thing that we'll say is, how do you feel about your debt? Then we start to get very different answers, and the hands tend to go down. And when we poll the room, what are some of the things that people say, Rich? Usually it's anxiety.
Anxiety, anger. I just want to ignore it. I don't believe that it's actually there. So everyone has different feelings about it, and Troy and I can do an entire kind of hour presentation on student loan debt and student loan repayment options, and by default from our experience in working with the medical professionals for all these years have kind of become pseudo experts in kind of student debt and IBR and pay as you earn and all the different public service loan forgiveness. We're not going to get into all the specifics here. Obviously everyone's situation is different. We're going to talk about debt on a more kind of global 10,000 foot level look at what your debt situation is and how it can potentially affect you going forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the important concepts is that it's very natural for people to have these feelings, to be anxious, to feel a little bit overwhelmed. But at the end of the day, one of the other things that we'll talk about when we meet with people is that that's okay, and that your debt is okay. And we get some puzzled looks sometimes when we do this, but the thought process here is, if you look at the balance sheet of any corporation in America, you're going to find debt, and oftentimes you're going to find a lot of debt. And why is that? Because it's leverage. Those corporations wouldn't be able to get as far as they're going to be able to get with the debt if they didn't have the debt in the first place. And I think if many of you look at your situations, you could say the same thing is true. You wouldn't be where you are right now. You wouldn't be able to follow your passion. You wouldn't be able to do the things that you're going to be able to do because you now have this debt. That being said, these corporations have, people, oftentimes lots of people, who are managing that company's debt to make sure that it is responsible and that they are making good decisions. And unfortunately for many of our clients, they don't have those, those people already in place. And so that is one of the roles that Rich and I try to help people play, which is, what is your debt strategy? How does that leverage work? Sometimes we're even having conversations about specialization versus not specializing, doing the fellowships and so forth as it relates to those financial elements. So as Rich said, everybody has a very different situation and philosophy as it relates to debt, and that's a very important sort of core discussion point here, is that no two people are going to have the same strategy for their debt. You've really got to understand your situation, your philosophy, your goals, and then help put that right plan into place. But there are some key points that I think are important to mention that I think do have a pretty broad range of application. The first one is paying off debt without sacrificing savings. The thought process here is that if all we're doing is paying off debt and we're neglecting to save, then if something happens, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to probably end up using a credit card and going right back into debt. So first we need to make sure that we have that at least the emergency fund in place, and then we can start talking about really aggressive paying off the debt. But the other point here is that many of the clients that we work with have very significant debt loads. And the concern there is that if all they do is pay off their debt, it might take them 7 or 10 years or maybe even a little bit longer to get that debt paid off. The problem there is that could impact their retirement savings. That could impact their children's education. So again, we need to take a step back and look at the context of the overall plan and not operate in a vacuum of just emotionally saying, gosh, I need to get this debt paid off. The way that we talk about this, there's an example that we use called the Rule of 72, and this just talks about how money doubles and compounds. You might have heard that term before, compounding interest. So the idea of the Rule of 72 just says, how long does it take my money to double? And it's kind of a fun example here. So if you divide the interest rate that you could earn on some hypothetical investment by 72, it'll tell you how long it takes that money to double. So if you are 30 years old and you have $10,000, when you're 30, $10,000. When you're 37, you'll have 20. When you're 44, you'll have 40. When you're 51, you'll have 80. When you're 58, you'll have 160. When you're 65, you'll have 320. Well, if that same person, when they were 23, had that $10,000, then that number on the other side would be double, so it would be 1.3 million, if you will. The thought process here is that it's that last double that's really important. So if we only operate in that vacuum and think about today, it could have a significant impact on the back end. Next piece is being organized. Again, kind of like we alluded to earlier, knowing who your lenders are, knowing what payments are due each month, so that if a bill doesn't come in, you know that it still has to be paid, because unfortunately, if you don't pay that bill, you're still going to be the one responsible for it. So one of the ways to do that is to create a debt consolidation spreadsheet. There's also ways that you can get a list of all of your lenders on the federal side. But again, the idea is just make sure you know who you owe what to and that you're on top of that. And then review your repayment options. Rich threw out a bunch of terms earlier: income-based repayment, pay-as-you-earn. There's lots of different options available to you. And again, you need to take a step back and understand what options, how they're going to act with the plan that you've created. Rich, thoughts here?
Yeah, no, the key point I think Troy hit on it great was that you just can't look at your debt as just your debt. You have to look at it in your whole situation, because if everyone just looked at their debt without looking at everything else, yeah, we'd want to pay it off as soon as possible. Nobody likes to have debt at, medium to high interest rates on their, in having accumulating interest. However, a lot of times you need to take a look at your entire situation and see, do I have other credit card debt that's higher interest, or whatever the case may be, lack of savings. You just can't look at it, in a vacuum. So that's kind of the most important component, because it's the number one question we get from students and residents that we're sitting down with is, what do I do with this debt? What's the best plan? I need to get rid of this as soon as possible. And, more times than not, that's not always the best decision, to just start paying as much as you can to the debt.
Yes, and do I save or pay off debt? We get that question, I think, almost every meeting that we have.
Yeah.
Rich, you want to go in and go through the disability piece here?
So another important component that we talked about in the foundation of the pyramid is protecting yourself and protecting your income. And for young physicians, this is what I would call critically important to them. You've basically gone through all of this schooling, all of this residency training, accumulated all this knowledge in your head. Some of you have accumulated a lot of debt as well. And basically, what disability insurance will do for you is allow you to be able to protect your ability to use all this skill and knowledge and information that you have accumulated if you're unable to work. So basically, you are trying to protect your ability to earn your income and to use the knowledge and practice your craft that you've spent all of these years going through. Basically, just by the nature of choosing to be a physician, you're putting yourself later in life to when you start to earn money, right? So you have extra schooling, medical school, you have all those years of residency training. So you're, somewhere between 8 and 10 years behind the average American worker. So protecting that income is going to be critically important for you, because that's now your ability to start to make money. Disability insurance comes in a lot of different flavors. It comes in a lot of different it's sold by a lot of different companies, and it's not always the easiest to understand. We'll go into with our clients a lot of specific detailed information, but what we want to allow you to know right now is it's something that you absolutely should be securing for yourself sooner than later, right? And we basically say that, when you're graduating medical school or just starting your residency is the ideal time to be able to get that. It is not something that you are guaranteed to get. You have to qualify for it medically, and that's the important piece. So the younger you are, the healthier you are, the easier it's going to be able to get, and the cheaper it's going to cost you. Once you lock in your coverage, you're locked in at that rate for your entire career. So the younger that you do this, the earlier, the cheaper it's going to be for you going forward. There are all sorts of different riders. There are all sorts of different things. Some key examples: you want to make sure you have guaranteed non-cancelable coverage. And the definition of disability for physicians is probably the most important. You want what's called own occupation or specialty occupation coverage, which covers you in the event that you can't perform the material and substantial duties of your job as a physician, all the way down to your specialty. There are riders that allow you to increase the coverage in the future when your income goes up, which is critically important. Even though you aren't making that money now, you're protecting your ability to make that in the future, and you don't have to requalify for it. So it's really important to get the coverage, secure it. You're locking in your health, and it allows you the ability to increase it. We do this a ton with all the different residency programs that are out there. Very important. Residency is not the easiest on you guys. It's long hours, long shift. It takes a toll on you guys health-wise. Very important. We see it all the time. Basically for docs to get this while they're young before any medical issues happen to them.
Yeah, and important. No, I was going to say an important item here as well is that most of your employers will have some element of group coverage available. It's just really not adequate. It doesn't do the things that we need this coverage to do to really protect you. So, as Rich mentioned, probably that most important item is your ability to increase this coverage after training. So essentially you're protecting your post-training income while you're still in training. So lots of different again, elements to the coverage, but the coverage through the hospital really doesn't do what it is that we need it to do to make sure that you're adequately protecting your income.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll mention about that too is, Troy and I are kind of pseudo experts again on this, as we have, been dealing with the medical profession for a long time. And what I will tell you is, we can certainly help with identifying the different types of coverages from the different companies, and we've been doing this for a long time. There are a lot of special concessions, discounted programs and stuff that we can provide and show to the physicians to be able to help them make the most informed decision.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'd say here is there's really only a handful of companies left that are relevant in the insurance and in the medical market. So it's important that who you're working with understands how to assist a doctor securing their coverage. There are a number of people out there that will say, oh yeah, I can get you disability coverage, but again, it's not specifically suited for a doctor. And as Rich said, it doesn't have that specialty specific language, which is very, very important. So just building off of the disability a little bit, talking about risk management more globally, life insurance, many times people for the same reason as the disability will choose to get life insurance sooner rather than later. It's one of those things that you don't get it just because you want it. You've got to qualify for it, but once you have it, nobody can take it away from you. So oftentimes we will suggest that people purchase that life insurance sooner rather than later. Certainly if they have a family and other people or a mortgage, other people that are relying on them financially. But again, similar to the disability, to protect that future insurability. Renter's insurance, again, if you don't have that 3 to 6 months expenses and emergency reserves, this renter's insurance becomes more important. But otherwise also just a key piece of your overall protection plan. Health insurance is generally going to be provided by your employer, but there sometimes can be multiple options, so those are something that we often help people review. Malpractice is generally covered by your employer, but if you are going out into private or more concierge medicine, that might not be the case. Property and casualty insurance, the one piece there is just to review your efficiency. If you're recently married, there are discounts available for when spouses coverage are through the same provider. So just making sure that you have a relationship with somebody. That's not a world that Rich and I get into, but we do have lots of people that we recommend to our clients. Not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I do want you to understand the different retirement plans that you're going to see out there. Essentially, the top two, traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs, are things that you can do on your own. And the bottom two, 401k and 403bs, are things that you're going to do through your employer. The difference between a 401k and a 403b is more that a 401k is going to be at a for-profit hospital and a 403b is going to be at a not-for-profit hospital. But essentially, they really work the same way. Just kind of real quick to kind of talk a little bit about this. On the individual side, the Roth IRAs are very popular in the residency community. The thought behind them is that when you put that money in, you actually can take out what you put in without any penalty. If you want to take out any earnings of that, there will be penalties, but if you just choose to put that money in, you could take it out at a later date if you wanted to. The difference in the taxation is the big one between the traditional and the Roth, which is in a traditional IRA, you're actually receiving a tax deduction. So if you make $50,000, you put $5,000 into it, you're only taxed on $45,000. So if you're in a let's say 20% tax bracket, then you're going to save $1,000 by making that deduction to the traditional IRA, or receiving that deduction from the traditional IRA. In a Roth IRA, you don't receive that deduction. If you earn $50,000, you put $5,000 into it. The money grows without paying taxes. When you pull it out at retirement, you're not paying taxes on it, but you didn't receive that deduction up front. And maybe I wasn't clear. In the traditional IRA, you receive that deduction, you don't pay taxes on the growth, but when you pull it out at retirement, you pay taxes on all of those monies. And that's going to be the case for the 401k and the 403b as well. The one caveat to that is that there are now what are known as Roth provisions to 401ks and 403bs in some cases, so you can actually make an after-tax contribution in your employer plan. Lastly, the biggest difference between the two is that in the employer plan, your contribution limits are going to be much higher than those limits that you're able to do on your own in the traditional or Roth IRA. So again, just a quick 30,000-foot overview. Those are the different things you're going to see. Most typically, people in residency are looking at things like Roth IRAs, and then when they're in their employment situations, that's when they're looking at making the 401k and the 403b contributions. Just a couple of items here. When you are talking about retirement planning and investing and so forth, people always ask us, well, how do I know if I'm making the right decision? The first one, I always say, if you can answer all of these questions and you can have a good understanding of them, you're probably on track to making a good decision. So the first one is, what is your tolerance for risk? Second, what's your time horizon? What are the expenses? And how is it taxed? Again, if you can answer all of these items and feel like you've got a pretty good sense of them, you're probably on track to make a good decision. A very common question Rich and I get, certainly among our resident clients and those that we speak with, will say, well, when is it time for me to work with a professional, and should I be working with a professional? Again, we work with some very bright clients and oftentimes say that, many of them may be able to do these things on their own. I think what we found over time, though, is that they really need to have these three items in place. They need to have the know-how, they need to have the interest, and then most difficult, they need to have the time. If they do have these three things, again, I think they very well may be able to do this on their own. Most people will say, I don't have those three things. I either really like this stuff, and I have the interest, I have the know-how, but I just don't have the time, or they have the time, they have the know-how, but they just don't really care. So bottom line, I think those are the three things that everybody needs to have. If not, they might want to consider working with an advisor. So after our session is just about coming to the end now. What do we do? Where do we go from here? So the first thing that we recommend is create an action plan, whatever that might be for you. Maybe it's just creating a budget. Maybe it's looking at your insurances, but take a step back, look at the big picture, and start working towards these different items that we've talked about today. Making the decisions in the context of a plan is always best. If you can understand where you're trying to go and understand how the decisions that you're making are going to allow you to get there, we think you're going to make much better decisions than if you operate in a vacuum and, again, only pay down debt or only save for retirement. Again, we want to look at that global perspective to make those best decisions. And then lastly, monitor and review. Set up a date to yourself. Put a calendar alert in your phone that every quarter, you're going to sit down for half an hour, 45 minutes, and just take a look at these things and make sure that everything is up to date. And then lastly, when you're making these big transitions, the three big ones of a physician's life, getting out of training, or getting out of med school, getting out of training, and retiring are those three big transitions. But those first two that are relevant to our conversation today, those are the real biggies that it's really important to take that step back and make sure that you're creating an action plan. One of the fun parts of working with physicians is that their incomes do make these big jumps, but it's also where potential pitfalls can lie. Lastly, we do offer consultations. So if somebody wanted to talk with us about these different items and help to create an action plan, that's something that we can do. We're happy to do that. Please just send us a note, and we're happy to do that. Rich, anything else that you want to add this afternoon?
No, I think it's just a matter of making sure that you're actually just focusing on it. It's never the number one priority for everyone to kind of go through this, but ultimately it's going to help your success going forward tremendously. The earlier that you start, the better off that it is. Procrastinating and kicking the can down the road is not a strategy. It's always good to be able to start looking at this. It's what we do. We're here to help. We're here as a resource. We work with a lot of physicians at all different stages, and we've basically pretty much seen every scenario, so we really do have the expertise to be able to help you guys make the decisions that are going to best help you succeed going forward. So the one piece of advice would be don't procrastinate. Start sooner than later, whether you think you're ready to or not. It's always going to be more beneficial the earlier that you start.
Great speaking with everybody today. Good luck, and as always, please let us know if there's anything we can help with. Bye-bye.